Good morning, New Life Church children. And today we have 5 children with us today, and I'm just so excited about that. So welcome, children, and those who are watching us live online. We are going to continue with the story that we have started 4 weeks ago. And I'm sure by now you know the name of the story, but what are we doing? It's The Biggest Story, written by Kevin DeYoung and illustrated by Don Clark. And I would highly recommend this book for your children, as it explains God's biggest story to us. So let's remember back on what we did over the last 3 weeks. What was our first chapter about? It was about God and Adam and Eve. And we saw how they fell into sin in spite of God's goodness and care for them. And then what happened? They were sent out of the garden. In chapter 2, what did we see? Who can tell me? Who can remember? That's right. We saw the story of Cain and Abel, as well as the story of Noah. But we also saw, and the Tower of Babel, but we saw how God was faithful to his people. He kept them in the palm of his hand, and he led them and guided and protected them. And it's amazing to see how he did that. Then we saw in chapter 3, we were introduced to a man named Abraham. Abraham. And remember, God chose Abraham, and he made a covenant with Abraham, and he promised to Abraham that him and his generation, his children, would be his people. And he chose certain of his sons to continue the promise that he had given to Abraham. So what are we going to learn about in chapter 4? Well, let's start reading and see. Chapter 4 of The Biggest Story. We ready? Okay. Several hundred years after God's promise to Abraham, it looked like things had gotten way off track. When God told Abraham to leave his home, he promised to give him a new land in Canaan. It was going to be a great land. It was supposed to remind God's people of the garden they once had. What was that garden called? It was called Garden of Eden. That's right, Ulrich. It would be a sweet and refreshing with plenty of milk and honey. But Abraham and his sons had never really possessed the land they were promised. And now it was 400 years later, and they were slaves in Egypt. Wow, what's going on? How could they be slaves in Egypt? So how Abraham's family got to Egypt is a long story. But here's the short version. They went to Egypt because there was a famine in Canaan. And when they got to Egypt, Jacob's son found their long-lost brother, Joseph, who helped them get food and a place to live, even though he was there because, why? The 10 brothers who had been jealous and sold him into slavery. They had almost killed him because of his fancy coat. If you look at our picture there, you can see there's a picture of the coat and of the money that was given for Joseph to be sold into slavery. But now God's people are in Egypt. Well, delivering them from famine, God's people from famine, was one thing. That's when Israel's family was still pretty small. So once again, Israel, by the way, was Jacob's new name. There are a lot of name changes in these chapters, aren't there? So Israel was Jacob's new name. I guess everyone needed 2 names back then. But hundreds of years later, the family was huge. So how was God going to save a couple of million people from slavery? That's how big his people had grown while they were in slavery in Egypt. Well, it's not like he could turn the Nile River into blood and send frogs and gnats and flies and disease and boils and hail and locusts and darkness and death until the king of Egypt let them go. But we know that that's exactly what God did. God raised up Moses to deliver his people. In reality, God did all the work. He sent the plagues. He led the people with fire and a cloud. Didn't he do that out of Egypt into the wilderness? He made the sea turn to dry land so that the Israelites could walk through. And he turned the dry land back to sea when the Egyptians tried to cross over. It seemed that no matter what the Israelites did and what everyone else did to them, God always found a way to save his people. And I want to read that line again. It seemed that no matter what the Israelites did, even if it was because of disobedience or sin or bad choices, no matter what they did or what everyone else did to them, including the Egyptian Pharaoh and king, God always found a way to save his people. And we know that God led the Israelites out of Egypt into freedom, didn't he? So children, what are we seeing in this story? What are those two important questions we want to ask ourselves? One, who is the story about? And what happened? So who the story is about and what happened. So we know the story is about God. Isn't that our first character? The first person in the story. It's about God. And then it's about his people who were trapped in slavery in Egypt. But what do we see, children? We see God faithfully providing and guarding and leading his children back out of slavery into the land that he's going to give to them. Children, we see God's faithfulness once again. Even though man was sinful, they made bad choices. Was our God unfaithful? Did our God change on the promise he had made to his people? No, he isn't. He's faithfully leading his people to the place where they need to be. And who gets all the glory from this? God, because he is doing all the work. Children, this is the biggest story, how faithful God is being to his children. And we will continue to see that in the next few chapters. So Auntie Estelle has sent out some children bulletins to help you understand more of these stories that we spoke about. Take some time this week and do them and enjoy learning more about our faithful God to his people. Okay, children, time to say goodbye. Let's wave and say bye to everybody. Take care. We love you. We miss you. And we cannot wait to see you all again. Lots of love. Send hearts. We're going to do the hamburger heart. I think so, Ulrich. Big round burger and bite. Love you, children. Blessings.